Welcome back to Rhythm Railroad. This is a tutorial video on how to install alternating ditch lights on stock N-scale Intermountain SD40-2 locomotives. Although the installation technique was different for each of the locomotives, they all required alterations to the shell and some milling of the frame to make room for electronics. The locomotive to the far left is number 3399. This locomotive was altered by shortening the fiber optic light tubes and then attaching the LED diodes to them, feeding the light through the remaining fiber optic tubes. The one in the center is number 3396. This install required scratch-built light boxes with the diodes glued directly to them. Holes were then drilled onto the platform to feed the wires through the hole and then into the existing fiber optic tube holes. The third locomotive on the right side is number 3400. The lights on this locomotive were installed similarly to the one on the left, number 3399. The difference is that the LEDs were placed directly on the front of the locomotive rather than using fiber optic tubes to project the light. In this particular video, I will be demonstrating the installation on the last locomotive, number 3400. Here's a demonstration of all three locomotives using their ditch lights. First, we will turn them on so you can see the intensity of each setup. Then we will blow the horn so you can see how they flash. Starting with the left locomotive, number 3399, with the fiber optic cable, then the center locomotive, number 3396, and then finally number 3400, also with the LEDs mounted directly on the front of the locomotive. Now we will blow the horn, starting with the left locomotive. Now we'll move on to the center locomotive, number 3396. And finally, number 3400 on the right side. So let's get started. Here's what you're going to need for this project. A Dremel tool. If you have one with an adjustment for speed, it would be better. Some black acrylic paint, a simple file. You'll need some kind of glue or adhesive. I like to use this particular one, which is a gel-based glue. It's easier for me to work with. You'll need a 1K or 2K resistor. You'll need some LED diodes, pre-wired. You'll also need a soldering iron that's adjustable. I run my iron for this project at about 650 degrees Fahrenheit. You'll need some Kapton tape. You'll also need solder. You'll need soldering paste, flux. You'll need basic tools such as a screwdriver, both flathead and Phillips head. You'll also need some kind of clippers for wire cutting and stripping. You'll need tweezers and any other small tool you could find. I like to use, for example, a pin to help me move things around or apply a glue in small spots, etc. Obviously, you'll need your locomotive And I like to use a jewel box to pop the shell off the locomotive and then to also hold the locomotive parts as I work on any kind of milling or alterations of the shell. Okay, here's the locomotive. What I'm going to do next is basically take the shell off the locomotive. I wanted to first show you what the side view and the front view were, so you can see what I'm going to be altering. So first let's focus on the ditch lights. As you can see, the ditch light boxes are installed from the factory right under the front platform. Those need to come out eventually so that we can put the diodes inside of those boxes. So the next step is to basically take the shell, put it into the jewel box, and use this technique, which is very basic for removing shells. By tapping on the jewel box and holding the shell, the frame basically comes right out. Then you can just pull the shell off and put it aside. Here's what the inside of the locomotive looks like with the decoder on top. And this is the way it is when you purchase the locomotive straight from the factory. There's no alterations there. So now I will put the basically the frame and everything aside while I work on selecting my diodes. These diodes are very small, and I forget the exact number, but they're 3-volt diodes. And because of that, you want to try to run them with a resistor. In fact, ESU recommends that you run them with a resistor. Otherwise, you'll blow them right out as soon as you put power to the locomotive. The amount of voltage coming from the decoder to the diode through the auxiliaries is 5 volts, which is too much. So right here, I'm selecting 2 very neat and well-wired diodes so that they'll be as compact as possible so that I can fit them into those boxes without any problems. I did have to play with them a little bit on the first install and actually destroyed one of them because the wire came off, and it's pretty much impossible to wire those things back on unless you have very good soldering skills. What I'm showing you here is a 3-volt battery. This is those kinds of batteries that you would put onto a remote control or something small, some kind of small electronic device. But I like these the best for testing my diodes because it's easy to hold. They're nice and flat, and you can get results right away. So as you can see, I'm testing the first diode here. The light that these diodes give are like a yellowish white, which I selected this way on purpose because just from seeing videos of ditch lights, they're not very white. They're on the yellow side. So I did get the warm white diodes to make it look more yellow. The next step is to remove the fiber optic light tubes that are installed from the factory. Now, in this particular install, we don't need them at all because we're not using them to reflect the light onto the front of the locomotive. We're simply using the paths of these tubes to run the wires through them. So we need the room, and therefore we have to remove these fiber optic tubes. So the way I do it is I basically just take some kind of clippers and that can fit in there and just snip them off. Now I try to get them so that I can still use them in the future if I need to for other projects. So you want to kind of be a little neat about it. But the last time I did this on my other locomotive, they came out they came out fully. But for some reason, when I did them here, you'll see in a second, they snapped. I guess they were glued very well, unlike my other locomotive, and that's why they snapped. As you can see, I just pulled the first one out, snapped right at the front, but that's okay. And now I'm taking the second one out, and I'll probably just do it the same way as the other time. Yep, it snapped off. Okay, now the little black pads that you saw me take off before that, those are just what Intermountain puts on there to block light, any kind of leakage that might be coming off the diodes that are installed onto the decoder. Now what I'm trying to do is take the excess light tubes, the fiber optics that are in there, that since it snapped off, they're stuck in there. But again, this locomotive was glued very well, because on my last one, they basically just fell off. They were not glued very well on those. So here what I'm doing is I'm taking the light boxes and just trying to snap them off without breaking them. But they're a little tricky to get off, as you can see. I'm having a little bit of a problem here. But eventually they do pop off. And there's the first one. As you can see, they're very, very small. Easy to lose. I did lose one of them on my other installs, but I did not need them anyway because I was installing the lights on top of the platform. So they weren't necessary. Once again, I'm trying to just kind of pop it off, and there it is. This is the second one. I know it's very hard to see on the camera, but they're extremely small. You have to be very careful not to lose them. So now I'll just put them aside until I put everything else away. And now I'm going to try to pull the little tubes that were left, fiber optic tubes that were left out. Again, because they were glued so well, I had to go and use something a little bit stronger to pull them out, as you can see there. So I'm pulling them out. Here's the second one. There you go. And I just put them aside, again, because I might use them in the future. But now at least I have what I need to install the wiring and the diodes exactly in that location. So I have a clean shell now. The next step is to clean the light boxes that I just pulled off a little bit. When you snap them off, sometimes there's like a little mounting peg that comes out with it. So you want to try to get like the flattest surface possible, because there's no way you're going to get those little pegs back in. And most likely they're broken off anyway. So once I got them nice and clean, what I did here is that I tried feeding the wire through the locomotive optical, the fiber optic hole, which was easy. And now I took the light box and pushed the diode into it. And what I'm doing here is I'm testing them to make sure that they actually work. Keep in mind that when you're working with these very delicate parts, the tendency is to have some of the solder come loose or some of the wires just pop off. So you should be testing every time you do something new to them. By the way, I don't know if you can see it from here, but the light from the diode is pushing forward and also reflecting back. You'll see it better here with the lights off. The reason for that is because it's throwing light everywhere right now. Even though I have it focused forward, but it's throwing light. You see it's throwing light into my finger also. So the way we're going to resolve that issue is by adding glue to the back of the light box. And again, with the gel glue that I use, it's easy to do that, because once you basically plug the back of the light board, rather the light box, then you can paint over it after it dries, obviously. So it basically seals it in, it holds it in place, and acts as a blocking or some kind of a light shield. So that's what I'm doing right now, using my magical pin, which I absolutely love to use. It's one of my best tools. Taking a little glue and just applying it to the back. Now I'm taking the same pin after I cleaned it and dipping it into the black paint and then applying the paint to the back, the sides, the top and bottom of the light box, just to make sure that no light escapes once the diodes are on and installed. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that the diodes are able to stay on the light box even before they were glued on, because I prepped the light box by cutting a small slit on the bottom of the box to accept the two wires. So basically, I made a little space for the wires to go in there, but tight enough so that they hold the diode and the wires in place. Obviously, once I put the glue on, it became a lot stronger of a bond. So here's the final product after it has dried. Both the paint and the glue have dried, and now it's all locked in place. And I'm just trying to get a close-up here just to show you more detail, but these things are so small that they're virtually impossible to focus on. So yeah, I'm just trying to show you the box, not the locomotive. But now the next step is to make sure I test it, because once again, you know, with the paint and the glue and the messing around, I want to make sure that they work. But first, I'm going to just feed the wires through. These were the optical tubes, the fiber optic tubes, the holes that were there already. And that's what I'm using to feed the two wires through. Now, I find that if you do one wire at a time, it's a little bit easier than if you try to push both through there, because they get tangled up and they get caught up inside, and sometimes it becomes more of a headache. So just do one at a time. I think it's just easier. Now, once again, I am trying to test the diode here. There it is. So it's lighting, and as you can see, well, I hope you can see this, but it's not shooting the light backwards anymore. Everything is projecting forward. So this is what it looks like. I had already installed one of them on this photo. This is a side view. So it fits in there nice and neat if you're careful with it. And once you glue it into place, then it's all good, and you won't be able to see the wires. So basically, what you have to do to get the wires in the right place is bend them. Now that they're glued, bend them carefully right at the edge of the light box. So now the orientation of the box is with the like a 90-degree angle between the wires and the back of the box. So as you feed the wire through, you're just basically pulling the box toward the locomotive front, and it'll be easier to install that way, rather than having to bend it when the wires are already in the locomotive shell. So once again, I'm doing one wire at a time because it's just easier for me. As you can see, the other wires and the other light box are already put there in place, and this would be the second time I'm doing this. So once I feed this black wire through, then all I have to do is kind of situate or position the light box near the front of the locomotive, so that then I can apply glue to it in order to keep it in place. So once again, I'm going to use my little pin. I'm going to take just a very small amount of the glue, and I'm going to put some on the back of the light box and the wires, and then some also below the platform. Now, the way the box is going to be glued on there, if I'm not mistaken, the wires are on the top part. So when you put the glue on here, you're actually allowing the wires to adhere to the top of the locomotive, but also by putting a little glue on the top of the light box, it is pushing up against the bottom of the platform, which gives it a nice tight bond. So in reality, I'm not putting too much glue behind the box because there's wires and all kinds of stuff. It's really the wires with the glue and the top of the box that are holding this in place firmly. So here you see me doing exactly that. I'm putting the glue in those two spots. And this glue doesn't dry super fast, but you do have to work, at a decent tempo here, so that you don't end up making a mess of this or having to break it off again if it's glued incorrectly. So with this is a little bit of a game here. You have to kind of play around with it. It's going to be a little push and pull situation. You're pushing with the tweezers, and also you're going to have to kind of pull from the back to take the slack off the wires, and also to kind of give it a little bit more pressure on the lights. And once again, you have to be careful not to pull the wire out completely by mistake, or loosen the solder from the wires to the diode, because then that would be very bad. You would have to start all over again from the first step. So be very careful doing this step. As you can see here, I've gotten the light box centered nicely and glued just like the other one, exactly where it belongs and exactly where it was before. The only difference is that now there's a diode in there instead of a fiber optic tube. So here we are, all the wires. The nice thing about these diodes is that they come pre-wired with fairly long wires, so I have plenty of room for error if I have to cut them 2 or 3 times. So here I am once again, as I said before, testing, making sure that both lights work, and they do, as you can see, and they're working individually. Okay, so now the next step is to take the clips that are holding the frame together off, because what we're going to do is completely disassemble the inside of the locomotive, meaning the frame, the motor, the drive shafts, everything, because we're going to be milling the actual metal part, the frame. And you don't want to get those metal shavings everywhere by leaving some of the parts in there, especially when you're dealing with the grease that is already on the gears and within the wheels and stuff. Because once you get that stuff in there, it's almost impossible to get off unless you strip them completely, and that's a headache. The other thing is that you're dealing with a speaker on the bottom of the locomotive, and that speaker has a magnet, like every speaker, and it attracts all of those little metal shavings, and eventually they get lodged in there, and then there's no way you're getting those off the speaker, and it might create some kind of rattling or distortion with the speaker. So the best thing to do is to just strip it completely and make sure that all the parts are safe. So as you can see, I'm using my jewel box to hold all the parts as I pull everything off. This doesn't have to be done necessarily in this order. You could, do it in many ways, but generally speaking, try not to force anything out if you can avoid it. That's a speaker that I'm pointing at right now. It's a sugar cube speaker, and you can see I'm trying to pry at it, but it's not working. So I'm just gonna, go in another direction and until everything just kind of comes off. It's funny because as I'm making this video, I've already, worked on my locomotives for a few more days after I shot this video, and I've learned, even in a few days, just better ways to do this. For example, I'm going to take the decoder out, and you'll see that I'm trying to, I guess you don't see it there, but I used to try to really open the frame up so I can slide the decoder out, not realizing that there's some spaces built into the decoder so that you can get around the frame and then slide it in. But I guess live and learn. What happened here is that the contact copper plates came off, just because they're probably just not in there very tight. That one in particular tends to come off a lot. That little plastic black plate that I just pulled off is a really nice thing that Intermountain includes in their locomotives. That kind of like protects the decoder from the frame so that you don't short it out. and it also keeps everything nice and snug and in place. One thing that I wanted to mention, and that's why I'm pointing at the locomotive during the video, is that I like to keep everything in the right orientation, meaning everything pointing forward where it should be forward and everything pointing backwards when it should be on the back side. So everything in that box right now is, including that speaker that I just put down, is exactly in the direction that it's supposed to be in. So when I take it to reinstall everything, I know which way it's supposed to be facing, and I don't have to keep guessing or looking at a manual or something. So here I am trying to, again, disassemble the frame, just take it apart. The motor has these little clips to keep it in place that go into the frame here, but for some reason these were tighter than the other ones that I've worked with. So it was a little bit tricky to get it to pop off, but eventually I got it. And I did have to use a knife to kind of like dislodge it a little bit, but it worked. And I feel like once you get it off the first time, then it's not as tight because you're dealing with very soft plastic. So once I got it off the first time, it was easy to get off. The next few times that I had to make some alterations. So once I pop the motor off, then what's going to happen is that the frame will be basically able to come apart in halves. And when you do that, then you're exposing all the gears and drive shaft and all the inner workings of the locomotive. So be very careful. Number one, not to lose anything because these parts are very tiny. But number two, to kind of notice which way they're installed so that when you reinstall it, you know what you're doing. I mean, it's very straightforward, and in some cases it's interchangeable. The front and the back are kind of the same. You just have to know, for example, on the motor, there's contact points where they have to be in the right location, obviously, because then they won't line up with the decoder contact points and with the speaker contact points either. So just be aware of that. So here I am with the shell open. There are some little black plastic spacers, particularly on these Intermountain locomotives that help keep the frame halves away from each other, so that if they touch, you're basically going to short out the whole locomotive. So those are really important. Don't try not to lose those, and they're extremely small. One of them popped off. That's why I had to reinstall it. But so just be careful. As you can see, I'm putting the drive shafts in order on the right side of the locomotive. One is the front and one is the back. And I'm taking the locomotive carefully apart. And the last part would be the motor here. And again, you have to take these little clips from the motor. You have to pop them off the frame for it to work. Now, I like to disassemble my locomotive in this particular order, with the frame, with that half of the frame that you saw facing down, because that's where the mounts are for the drive shafts. On the other side, you don't have those mounts. So if you try to basically lean, there's a little plastic thing that I was talking about. If you try to basically lean the locomotive on the other side, you have nowhere to mount these, drive shaft blocks. So it's better to use the one that has the mounts in it. All right, so what I'm doing now is I'm reassembling the empty frame. So there's nothing on it, with the exception of the contact leaves here. That doesn't matter if you get some metal on there or whatever. But it's important that you put the clips back on, because that's going to hold it in place while you're milling. It basically has a way to fit together nicely without the clips, but if you have the clips, it just helps keep everything locked in, and then you don't have to worry about holding it together with your fingers. Once again, this little thing fell out again, so I just pushed it back in. Okay, that's the front of the locomotive, that's the back, that's what I'm showing you. that the back, the clip is on top, and the front, the clip is on the front of the locomotive. That's a good way to know what to do. Now here's my technique for using a Dremel and for milling. What you see under my hand, basically under my wrist, is my home vacuum cleaner, without the hose, obviously. And I have that running so it sucks up all the metal shavings as I use the Dremel tool and as I mill the locomotive frame. I'm not using eye protection, but I am using a huge magnifying glass with a light that's blocking my entire face. So any metal shavings that are being spit up are not going into my eyes, my mouth, my nose, or nothing. And you do get a little bit outside of, the vacuum's not going to suck everything up. So you do get a little bit on the table and, shooting around, but it's nothing dangerous that's going to affect anything later. So again, I'm holding the vacuum cleaner down with my left wrist, basically, in that book. I'm basically just leaning on it. And I'm using the Dremel to make space here for the what's going to be living in that space is going to be the resistor. As you can see here, I'm testing out the spacing. And just a heads up, when I did this originally, I did not make the hole extremely deep. The goal is to get it so that you create a pocket right under the decoder spot. There's like a kind of like a level for the decoder, and then there's like a little drop for the front of the locomotive, and you're trying to create a pocket under there for the resistor. Now I don't know if they make smaller resistors. They might. In fact, they probably do. But this is all I had in hand, so I just went with this. And it was small enough. It actually fits perfectly as far as the width of the locomotive and the width of the resistor. It fits perfectly there, so it actually worked out pretty well. But I suppose if you had a smaller resistor, it would be easier to install. So as I chip away here at the frame, you got to be careful not to go too deep, because then you'll be in the chamber for the motor. So you don't want to go through. But just a side note, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it already, I had to go a lot deeper later on, because even though everything was working nicely, and I did make some nice videos with the pocket this size. It was still kind of pushing the front of the locomotive shell up a little too high. So the whole locomotive shell was kind of like in an up angle by a little bit, but it was just annoying enough for me to notice it. So I did have to reduce the front part of that entire locomotive frame. I have to basically trim it down quite a bit. And then I also had to make the pocket for the resistor a lot deeper to get it tucked in and out of the way so that it wouldn't hit the shell. So what I'm showing you here is the decoder. The decoder for this locomotive, for some reason, came with these little squares and these little, I guess they're just spacers, but you don't need them. I just kind of ripped them off because they were getting in the way. My other locomotives didn't even come with them, so I know that they're not necessary. I think this was just maybe like another production that they made a little later on, and they decided to put those on. But again, you don't need them. I've had my other ones working nicely without them. So I'm taking them off so I can make my soldering a little bit easier here. What I'm doing is I'm taking my good old pin again with a little bit of the flux paste, and you can see there's 3 plates that I'm working with here. There's an auxiliary 3, an auxiliary 4, and in the middle there's a V plus, which means voltage plus. And what they're asking you to put there is the positive wire from the diodes. So the black wires are going to be attached to the aux 3 and the aux 4. Doesn't matter which way, as long as you do one for each. But the positive wires are going to have to be combined and they're going to be soldered onto the V positive plate in the center. Now here's the thing, like I mentioned before, the voltage coming out of there is 5 volts, and the diodes can only handle 3. So that's why you have to run a resistor through that V plus plate. Now what I did is I took a little wire and I soldered it to the V plus plate, and then went to the resistor, and from there I went to both red wires that came from the diodes. So if I'm still kind of new at soldering, and I'm still kind of getting around all the techniques and stuff, but I think I've learned enough to be able to do this correctly. What I'm doing here is I'm prepping the plates with just a little bit of solder. So all you got to do is just touch it with a little bit of solder and make like a little bubble of solder, so that when you get ready to introduce a wire, it'll just grab it. It basically like sucks it in if it's done correctly. So I just prepped my 3 plates here. As you can see, you see the little bubbles of solder? That's what you need. You don't want to put too much solder because it might leak onto the other plates, and then you'll have a short or some kind of, you might even burn out the decoder because it's not meant to be touching. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to prep the wires from the locomotive shell by tinning the tips of these wires. Now this is a typical thing that you do because you want to make sure that the solder is both on the wire and whatever is receiving the wire. It just makes it a lot easier for the solder to take. So first of all, I got to decide how long these wires are going to be, cut them, and then what I'm doing here is I'm twisting them so that since these are stranded wires, I don't want any like very tiny loose wires in there flopping around that might cause a short as well. Now once I strip them, and as you can see I'm stripping it and twisting them, then the next step would be to what we call tinning the wire. So we're going to tin each one of those tips, including the 2 red wires that are going to be actually twisted together. So the black wires stay by themselves, and then the red wires are going to be combined because they're going to the resistor, and from the resistor to the V plus plate. So again, by putting a little flux paste on them, and then just putting a little solder on the iron rather, and then applying it to the wires, it tins them. It basically seals them and gives them enough solder so that they can be attracted or pulled into the other solder on the decoder. So after you're done tinning every wire, then the next step would be to solder the wires accordingly to the decoder. But the other thing, which is what I'm doing here, is that you don't want a very long piece of exposed wire at the end, because again, you don't want any part of that wire to be touching anything except what it needs to be touching. And the plates are so tiny on the decoders that you need very, very little wire exposed on all of the wires that are going to be soldered here. Okay, so now that I have combined the red wires and tinned them, and also the black wires the same way, the next step is to prep the resistor. This is a 1K resistor, and what I'm doing here is basically cutting them as short as possible on each end so that, again, the least amount of metal will be exposed. But at the same time, you need to make sure that there's enough surface area for the wire to attach itself to the resistor. So just like the wires, it is important to tin the exposed wires from the resistors. And again, it's just to create a bond a lot better and a lot faster. So that's what I'm doing here, just like I did with the wires. Just a little bit of solder goes a long way. You don't need to glob it on there. And I'm obviously going to have to do it on both sides. So I have to make sure that I apply the flux to both ends. So now here we are with the other side. And obviously I'm doing the same thing. The first thing is to apply the flux onto the tip. Then take the soldering iron. I already had a little bit of solder on there, but just take a little more and just make sure you got enough on the exposed wire of the resistor to create a nice bond. Now that I have everything in place and ready to go, the next step is to take the resistor and glue it to the two red wires that are coming from the locomotive shell. So it's good to apply flux to both ends, again, just to create a faster bond as you try to solder them together. This is a little tricky when you're dealing with floating wires like this, and unless you have like some kind of jig or something set up, it's a little bit of a a little bit of a maneuver. What I did here is I just basically laid the wires over the handles from these clippers here, just to give it a little bit of space from the rubber mat that's under there, and this way I don't melt it, and then also to stabilize the wires. So right now I'm just taking basically a little touch of solder to the resistor and the wires, and I'm just connecting them that way. So I think what happened here is that I had too much length on the red wires, so I wasn't happy with that, and I went back and just shortened everything up once again. So here I am trying to reconnect the resistor to the double red wires, and this just takes a little practice. It took me a while to figure it out, but if you just have a little patience and you just use a little finesse, it's easy to do. So there it is. Now the bond is nice and strong, and it's connected to the resistor. Now I'm taking just one of the leftover pieces that I had cut of the red wire, and just making a very, very small cut to attach to the decoder. This wire is going to be basically a lead from the middle plate, which is the positive voltage plate from the decoder, out to the resistor. Now the resistor is going to be placed basically right in front and under that plate that I'm describing. So you don't need a lot of wire. In fact, what I'm using right now is probably a little too much, but I'd rather have a little bit of play in the wire in case I need to move things around, or if I'm working around the resistor. I don't want it to be pulling a lot on the wire where it might disconnect. So once again, it's the same technique. You have to tin the wire ends, even though it's a small wire, you still have to do it, and then cut them nice and short like I did with the other ones. And it was a little tedious, so I stopped recording here, but you can see that I'll point it out here with my knife. The middle plate, red wire, is the V plus plate. So it's coming from the decoder over to the resistor, and from the resistor on the other end, it's that's where the two red wires are going. And then obviously the black on one end and the other black on the other end for the aux 3 and aux 4. Again, those two don't matter. You could switch, you could interchange them. They could be soldered both ways. Now that I'm all wired up here with the decoder, resistor, and the shell is all in place, now I have to take the frame and pull it back apart. Remember, I had just milled it, so I just left it alone until I was ready for this next step. So the idea here is that we're reassembling the inner workings of the engine. So the motor, the drive shafts, the speaker, everything else that we took out before has to go back in now. But now you don't have the risk of getting the metal shavings all over those delicate parts. So again, keeping in mind that the orientation is important, and also that one half has the mounting blocks and the other half does not. It's going to make your life a lot easier if you have a system like I've developed here, so that I know exactly what needs to be put where, in what direction, and also that I know it's going to have some kind of support and some kind of exact place to hold all these little delicate parts. So again, one half of the frame has the mounting blocks. That's the one you want to have on the bottom, so that when you start putting things in place, everything's being held together. The other half of the frame, I basically see as a cap. So once I'm done installing everything, then I just throw the other part on top, and it makes things a lot easier. So you'll see me put all the parts back together here, and then here's where I take the cap, or the second half of the frame, and kind of sandwich everything together. And then here's the speaker. The speaker can be put in by snapping it in at the end, or by sliding it in before you're done. But just make sure it snaps in all the way, because the last time I did this, I didn't quite get it all the way in, and it started to rattle like crazy, and I thought it was just either cracked or damaged. And once I popped it back in, it sounded fantastic, nice and clean with no distortion. So just be aware of that. The contact points on the speaker are just basically touching two contact points that are coming from the top of the motor and from the decoder. Intermountain does a nice job with just including that into their motors, at least for this particular SD40-2 model. And so it's easy to just replace and install these sugar cube speakers. So here I am just trying to put everything back together. And then obviously once you have everything in place, you want to make sure that you include this plastic piece. Don't forget about that, it's important. And that isolates the frame from the decoder when you get ready to install the decoder. Now, here I am trying to install the decoder onto the frame, and as you can see, there's a lot of wire that I have. So there's a lot of playroom for me. I have the shell quite far from the frame, and I'm still able to move the decoder around without a problem. I did end up going back after I shot this video and shortening those wires. Now the reason I did that was because it was becoming extremely difficult to shove all those wires, that huge wire length, into the shell without pinching them or cutting them with the frame as you put the shell on top of the frame. So I ended up soldering, disconnecting all the wires and starting again. And I'm really happy that I did that, because now it's a lot easier to to work with. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the resistor pocket, even though it worked and I was able to put everything in place, it still became a little bit too high for the shell to fall into place the right way. So it was hitting just a little bit to lift it off the frame, and it didn't look quite right. So I was able to take that pocket and just make it a little deeper, and just have the resistor basically disappear under the decoder without touching it, obviously. So I got the clips back on, and what I'm doing now is I'm taking a little Kapton tape and putting it over the frame here, just to be safe, just to make sure that if anything is exposed from the resistor or anything like that, that it's not going to short with the frame. So better be safe than sorry. So I put a nice long sheet here that's going to be covering all of those metal parts, and I'm just using the screwdriver to push it into that pocket so that it allows for the resistor to sit there nicely. Then I'm just cutting off the excess tape from the front. And once I have it nice and neat and clean, then it's easier to work with. So what I'm doing now is that I'm pushing the resistor into its pocket and then taking the Kapton tape and basically holding it in place by putting it up and across that particular spot where the resistor is. And then just making sure that the Kapton tape doesn't go too far down. I'm just trimming it here so that it doesn't get tangled up in the motor or any of the drive shafts or anything like that. So it should just basically be on the frame and nothing else. So again, this tape installation serves two purposes. One is to make sure that it's isolating any metal parts from the shell, from the frame, and two, it's holding everything in place, so it's not moving around while the locomotive is moving, and everything is nice and firm and in its place. Now, what I'm doing here, because I had so much wire, I'm twisting all the wire basically together just to create a neater string of wires rather than having wires all over the place like spaghetti. But again, it ended up being too much anyway, so that's why I shortened them in the last alteration. Now what I'm doing here is I'm taking, after the wires were twisted together, I'm taking one last piece of tape and just putting it on top of that, just to center the wires and to kind of take the pressure off the resistor a little bit and off the decoder. This way I can tug and pull a little bit more on the rest of the wires as I try to place them inside the shell, because it's only natural that that's going to happen. And I don't want to take the risk of pulling it off the resistor and then having to go back and resolder everything. So that's what's happening here. Also, with this, with this scale, you have to be as neat as you can possibly be, because everything is so small that little sloppy things that you let go turn into big problems later on. So any little piece of tape that's hanging over or anything like that, try to to be neat and just trim everything so that it's not sticking out or anything like that. It'll help you later on. Okay, so I just installed the fuel tank, which also has holes in the bottom to let the sound out of the speaker. And now I'm just taking the two trucks for the locomotive and popping them in. They're very easy to pop in. You just basically put them over the hole, and if you just push down on the frame slightly, they pop right in. The orientation is also important here. The trucks have these like pins that point inward, so make sure they're not pointing the other way, because it'll hit the frame in the wrong places and they'll get tangled up. So now this is the part that I was telling you that became a little bit of a headache. Trying to get the shell and all these wires shoved into the cabin of the locomotive. But it was very, very difficult because as you got one side in, then the wires were sticking out the other side, and all it takes is just a little too much pressure, and between the shell and the frame, you're actually making like a quasi scissor, and it'll just cut the wires right in half. They're so delicate. So again, I went back and shortened them, and everything is so much easier to deal with now. It's still not perfect, but it's definitely easier. So once I get all these wires tucked in and everything in place, I'm basically done with the install. So the last thing would be to test them out on the layout, but I just want to be sure here that everything is, that I'm not rushing through this and everything is in the right place. Okay, so as you can see, I had to stop recording and move ahead because it was really becoming a lengthy process. But I finally got all the wires in place, and I was able to pop the shell back on. But as you can see, I'm still playing with it because I can't quite get it to fit in the right place. These intermounted locomotives, these SD40-2s, have a little peg on the frame that fits directly into a little slot in the plastic, so it's very easy to align. Now I wanted to show you a picture here of the final install, and this is after I went back and remodified the frame. I had to make the pocket for the resistor a little bit deeper in order to get a little bit more room for the shell to fit in. The shell body and the cab window were actually hitting the resistor at this point. So I also wanted to show you guys the modification I made to the other locomotive that used the light tubes instead of just mounting the LEDs directly onto the front of the engine. As you can see here, I had to clip and shorten the light tubes that existed from the factory locomotive, and then add the LED into a shrink tubing for wires, and then wrap it around the tubes that were already modified in order for the light to project through the tube and to the front of the housing for the lights. Finally, I just wanted to show a quick photo of the locomotive with the shorter wires. I had altered everything to make it shorter in order to be able to stuff all the wires into the shell a little bit easier. So I hope you enjoyed the video on the installment of the ditch lights. As you look at the prototype here, which is what I used to help me figure out positioning and everything, I'm going to leave you off with a demonstration of all three locomotives and how they work with their flashing ditch lights.